I came to his land at the edge of dusk when the sky was a soft burn of red and violet, and the earth itself seemed to sigh under the weight of the dying sun. Dust clung to my hem, my boots were cracked, and my heart, though it had long practiced silence, thudded unevenly beneath my travel-worn bodice. I had been walking for days, chasing work, shelter, or simply somewhere to stop feeling like a ghost. The land was harsh and endless. Nothing but stretches of dry grass, cottonwoods leaning over shallow creeks, and far-off silhouettes of cattle moving slow beneath the evening star. Then out past the rise I saw smoke curling upward from a chimney, thin and blue against the dimming sky. A ranch, and beside the corral stood a man, tall and still as though carved from the land itself. The moment I saw him, something deep within me stilled. Not in fear, but in a way I hadn't known was possible. He didn't move when he saw me first. He simply stood, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady, and even from that distance I felt it. The weight of being seen, truly seen, in a world that had never once stopped to look. They called him the half-blood rancher, though I hadn't known his name then. Some said he was Apache. Others said he wasn't anything that fit into the neat lines people like to draw. The stories about him in town were whispered, that he'd once fought beside warriors, that he'd lost family to the white man's war, that he lived alone because no one wanted to live beside him. But the man I saw by that corral was nothing like the rumors. There was no violence in his stillness, only the quiet strength of someone who had made peace with the land, or maybe with his solitude. He turned as I neared, the fading light catching the copper tones of his skin, the dark glint of his hair that brushed his collar, and the faint, unreadable curve of his mouth. His eyes, came deep, almost black, that found mine with a calm that rooted me where I stood. "Evenin'," he said, his voice low, carrying the slow cadence of someone who didn't waste words. I managed a nod, breathless though I'd done nothing but walk. "I was told there might be work out here," I said softly. "I can cook, clean, sew, whatever's needed." He studied me for a long while, his gaze quiet but heavy, like he could read the truth I hadn't spoken. That I was tired, alone, and had nowhere left to go. "This isn't a place folks come looking for work," he said finally. "It's too far from everything." He paused, his eyes flicking to the horizon, then back to me. "But you can stay the night. Ain't right for a woman to be walking under the coyote moon." I wanted to refuse, propriety, pride, fear, all warring inside me. But the way he said it left no room for suspicion. It wasn't an offer. It was a promise. He led me past the corral, the scent of horses and leather mingling with sage carried on the wind. The ranch was small, a main cabin of timber and stone, a few outbuildings, and a stretch of fenced pasture where cattle grazed in shadows. Everything bore the mark of a man who worked with his hands. Tools hung in order, wood chopped and stacked, nothing wasted, nothing showy. He walked with long, even strides, saying nothing, though his presence filled the silence like music. When we reached the bunkhouse, he opened the door and stepped aside. Inside it was clean, simple. A narrow cot, a basin, a folded blanket. "You can rest here," he said. "Water's in the barrel outside. If you're hungry, there's stew in the pot." He started to leave, but I found myself asking his name before I could think better of it. "Elias," he said without turning. "And you?" I told him mine, and for a brief second something softened in his face, the faintest smile perhaps. Then he nodded once and disappeared into the twilight. That night, I washed the dust from my skin, the water cold against the day's heat, and lay beneath the coarse wool blanket listening to the stillness of the ranch. Somewhere outside a horse snorted, and I heard his footsteps on the porch, slow and measured. Then came the faint hum of his voice, low, rhythmic, and in a language I didn't know. It wasn't singing exactly. It was something older, softer, like the earth itself breathing through him. The sound curled through the cracks in the walls, wrapping around me until my eyes grew heavy. I dreamed of rivers running red under sunset, of hands brushing through my hair, of being seen without shame. When morning came, the light was golden and gentle, spilling across the floorboards like liquid fire. I stepped outside, and there he was, already at work, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, the lines of his arms flexing as he hoisted a saddle. He looked up as I approached, nodding once in greeting. "Sleep all right?" he asked. I nodded. "I did, thank you." He shrugged as though kindness came to him as naturally as breathing. "There's coffee in the pot," he said, turning back to the horse. Help yourself. As I watched him move, quiet, deliberate, his every motion sure and grounded, I felt something unfamiliar stirring inside me. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a sense of safety I hadn't known since I was a child. I'd lived my life among men who talked too loud, drank too hard, and looked at me like I was something to be used and discarded. But this man, he looked at me like I was part of the land. Not something fragile, but something real. When he finally turned to meet my gaze, the corners of his mouth lifted again, almost shy. "If you plan on staying till you find work, I could use a hand in the kitchen," he said. "Ain't much of a cook myself." I smiled then, the first real smile I'd felt in months. "I'd be glad to," I replied. His eyes lingered a moment longer, warm and unreadable. "Then I reckon we'll get along just fine." The days that followed were quiet ones, filled with the kind of peace I'd forgotten existed. Morning came early on Elias's ranch, the sun spilling soft gold across the mesa, the smell of dew and dust mixing in the air, and the faint creak of the windmill spinning above the well. I woke to the sound of horses snorting in the corral and to his voice deep and steady, calling them by name like they were old friends. At first I tried to keep to myself. I cooked, cleaned, mended what needed mending. But it was hard to stay invisible when the silence between us began to change. He'd come in for breakfast, boots tracking dirt across the floor, and I'd pour him coffee without a word. Sometimes our hands brushed when I passed him the cup, and the warmth that shot through me had nothing to do with the fire on the stove. He'd give me that quiet nod of his, half shy, half something deeper, and I'd feel my cheeks warm, though he never said much more than, "Thank you." But words weren't how he spoke. Not really. It was in the way he fixed a loose shutter without me asking, or left a folded blanket by the door when he saw I shivered in the night. Those small kindnesses done without a trace of pride built something steady between us, like stones laid carefully into place, forming a home before either of us realized it was happening. By the end of the first week, I had learned the rhythm of his life. He rose before dawn, tended to the animals, rode the range until the light began to fade. I learned to read his silences, when he was thinking, when he was remembering, when he was simply listening to the wind move through the grass. Sometimes in the afternoons he'd bring the horses down by the creek, and I'd sit nearby sowing or shelling beans, watching the sunlight play across the water. He never asked me questions, but he listened when I spoke, really listened as if every word mattered. One afternoon when the air was warm and still, I told him about my family, about how I'd been sent west with promises that turned to dust. I told him how people looked at me when they saw I had no husband, no dowry, no kin left to speak for me. He didn't pity me. I could see that in his eyes. He just nodded slowly, gaze fixed on the horizon. "People talk too much," he said after a while. "The land don't care who you were before, only what you are now." I didn't answer, but the truth of it sank into me like sunlight into cold skin. Maybe that was why I stayed. The first time he laughed, it startled me. It was late evening, the two of us sitting outside the cabin while the sky blazed orange and violet. I had burnt the bread that morning, distracted by the sound of his singing from the barn, and the charred loaf had been sitting on the table ever since. He'd said nothing at the time, only smiled faintly, but now as I teased him for the way he talked to his horses, he let out a low, rolling laugh that caught me off guard. It was a rare sound, deep and full of warmth, and it loosened something in me. "You think I talked to him?" he said, still chuckling. "Maybe they understand better than most folks." I laughed too then, and for a moment the weight of the past lifted clean off my shoulders. The air between us changed that night, softer, closer. When he stood to stoke the fire, the glow lit his face, turning his eyes into pools of molten amber. He looked at me for a long moment as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. Then he said quietly, "You belong here more than you think." The words hung in the air, gentle but heavy. I didn't know how to answer, so I didn't. I just met his gaze and let the silence say what I couldn't. As summer deepened, the world around us grew full with life. The cattle grazed, fat and lazy. The horses gleamed in the sun, and the night stretched long and sweet. Sometimes when the heat was thick, Elias would ride out shirtless, the sun bronzing his skin, and I'd catch my breath watching him from the porch. The easy strength in his shoulders, the sure way he moved. There was beauty in him, but not the polished kind I'd seen in towns. His was carved from labor and solitude, from wind and prayer. He carried both wildness and peace within him, and though I tried not to let it show, I was drawn to that balance like a moth to flame. One evening, a storm rolled in over the ridge, dark clouds rumbling low, lightning flashing across the open plains. I was gathering laundry when the wind picked up, and before I knew it, the clothesline snapped. He appeared beside me out of nowhere, rain soaking his hair, his hand gripping mine as he pulled me under the porch. We were both laughing, breathless, soaked through. When the thunder cracked above us, he reached to brush a strand of wet hair from my face, his fingers rough and gentle all at once. The world seemed to stop then, only the rain and the warmth of his touch. Neither of us spoke, but everything that needed saying was already in his eyes. When he finally pulled back, the ghost of a smile lingered on his lips. "You're safe," he murmured, and I was. From that night on, something unspoken lived between us. It wasn't rushed or reckless. It was a quiet current that ran beneath every word, every shared glance. He'd bring me wildflowers sometimes, small desert blooms that most people would overlook, but he'd place them on the table like treasures. I began to hum as I worked, and he'd pause to listen. I'd find myself waiting for his shadow to pass by the window in the evenings, my heart rising at the sound of his footsteps. And though we'd never touched beyond that one moment in the storm, I carried the memory of his hand against my skin like a secret prayer. There was comfort in the rhythm of our days, but there was also yearning, the kind that grows quietly like roots beneath the soil, unseen but unshakable. I didn't know if he felt it too, but sometimes when he looked at me across the supper table, I thought I saw the same softness mirrored there, the quiet ache of two souls learning what it means to be found. The summer heat grew thicker as the days rolled on, and with it came a restlessness I could neither name nor fight. It lived in the quiet between chores, in the way I found myself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch, in the way my breath caught whenever his shadow fell across the doorway. Elias moved through those long days with his usual calm, always steady, always sure. But there was a new quiet in him too, one that seemed to mirror my own. He'd watch me sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking, his gaze lingering just a little too long, his mouth parting as if to speak before he'd turn away and busy himself with the horses. I tried to convince myself it was only kindness I felt, that I was simply grateful to him for taking me in, for giving me shelter and peace. But gratitude didn't explain the way my pulse quickened when he stood close, or the way the air seemed to hum whenever he was near. It wasn't the loud, desperate kind of wanting I'd seen before in the towns. It was quieter, older, as though the land itself had conspired to draw us together. One evening, near the end of July, the air was heavy with the smell of sage and thunder. The cattle had been restless all day, and Elias had ridden out to check the northern fences. I waited for him by the window long after the sun had gone down, the lamp burning low. When he finally returned, he was dusted with the red of the plains and tired to the bone. "Storm's moving in fast," he said as he came inside, shrugging off his coat. "You should stay in the main cabin tonight. Wind's too rough for that old bunkhouse." I hesitated, though I didn't know why. There was something in the way he said it. Not commanding, not casual, just tender, like he was trying to protect more than my safety. The rain began not long after, a hard, steady drumming against the roof. He built a fire while I fetched coffee, and soon the cabin glowed warm against the storm. I sat across from him, watching the light dance across his face. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It had become something sacred, full of words we hadn't yet found the courage to speak. He broke it first. "You ever think about leaving here?" His voice was low, his eyes fixed on the fire. I thought for a moment before answering. "I used to think I'd keep running until I forgot where I came from," I said softly. "But lately it feels like the world finally stopped spinning." He looked up then, meeting my eyes, and I saw something raw there, something that made my chest ache. "You don't owe me anything," he said after a while. "If you ever want to go, you can." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I don't want to go." The words slipped out before I could stop them, but once they were free, I didn't wish them back. He drew in a slow breath, and in the next heartbeat, the air changed. The thunder rolled far off, the rain softened against the roof, and all I could hear was the sound of our breathing. Slow, uneven, shared. He stood, moved toward me, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other. There was no rush in him, no presumption, only the question in his eyes and the quiet promise in mine. When he finally reached out, his fingers brushed my cheek, light as wind, reverent as prayer. I closed my eyes and leaned into the touch, every wall I'd built around myself falling silent. "You're shaken," he murmured. "Not from fear," I whispered back. I don't know who moved first, only that suddenly his hands were at my shoulders, steady and warm, and I was standing close enough to feel his heartbeat under my palms. He smelled of smoke and rain, of leather and wild earth. When his forehead rested against mine, the world fell away. No past, no judgment, no distance between what was and what could be. "Elias," I breathed, the sound barely a word. His name felt like belonging. He lifted my chin then, and our eyes met, his dark, mine trembling. And whatever had waited between us for all those long, quiet days finally found its voice. The first kiss was slow, uncertain at first, but full of meaning. His lips were warm, the touch gentle, almost reverent, as if he feared breaking the fragile truth of what we'd become. It wasn't hunger that drove it. It was recognition, a deep knowing that we had both lived too long without being seen. When we finally parted, neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The fire popped softly in the hearth. The rain whispered against the window, and his thumb traced the edge of my jaw like he was memorizing it. I'd never felt safer in my life. That night, I didn't return to the bunkhouse. He made no move to stop me when I stayed, no claim beyond the simple offering of his presence. I lay awake beside the sound of his breathing, the storm easing into silence beyond the walls. In the glow of the dying fire, I watched the rise and fall of his chest, the way his hand rested over his heart as though holding something precious. I realized then that love, when it was true, didn't need to be loud. It didn't demand. It waited, patient and steady like the desert waiting for rain. When dawn came, I woke to sunlight spilling across his face and the faintest smile on his lips. He opened his eyes and looked at me like he couldn't quite believe I was real. "Mornin'," he said quietly. My voice caught when I answered. "Mornin'." And in that single word there was everything: gratitude, wonder, the fragile beginning of forever. The days that followed were like nothing I had known before, full of small moments that stitched themselves into something whole and quiet and true. Life on the ranch didn't change in its rhythm, but everything within me had shifted. Each morning I woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke, to the gentle sounds of Elias moving through the cabin, and I found peace in the simple act of being there. There was no need for many words between us. Our love had its own language. In the way he handed me my cup before I'd even asked, in the way his hand brushed mine when he passed me tools, in the shared laughter that came easy now. The land had grown softer too, as if reflecting the gentleness between us. The grass bent golden in the wind, the creek sang louder, and even the sky seemed to stretch wider. I sometimes thought that maybe the world had been waiting for us to find each other, that somehow, amidst all its harshness, it had carved out this quiet corner just for two lonely souls to meet. But love, even the truest kind, doesn't mean the world stops testing you. Late that summer, a drought settled over the valley. The creek thinned, the cattle grew restless, and the ground cracked beneath our boots. Elias worked harder than ever, riding farther each day to find water for the herd. I did what I could, and I mended gear, cooked, prayed to a God I wasn't sure was listening. He never complained, but I could see the strain wearing on him, the shadows beneath his eyes, the lines that deepened at his mouth. One evening he came back long after dark, his horse lathered, his shirt soaked through with sweat and dust. I met him at the door with water, and as he drank I saw his hands shaking. "You can't keep this pace," I said softly, taking the cup from him. He shook his head. "Can't stop now," he murmured. "If the herd dies, there'll be nothing left come winter." I wanted to argue, to make him rest, but I knew better than to fight the kind of stubborn born from duty. So instead I reached up and wiped the dirt from his cheek with the edge of my apron. "Then we'll face it together," I said. His eyes met mine, weary, grateful, and he nodded once as if that promise alone gave him strength. In those hard weeks, our love became something deeper. We worked side by side from dawn to dusk, hauling water, fixing fences, moving cattle through the night. Sometimes we didn't speak for hours, too tired even for words, but the silence between us was full of understanding. At night, we'd sit on the porch, watching the stars burn sharp against the black sky. The drought had stripped the land bare, but the heavens had never looked brighter. One such night, as we sat shoulder to shoulder, I asked him about his mother. the Apache woman who had given him his quiet strength. He spoke slowly, voice low and rough, telling me how she'd taught him the old songs, the stories of wind and fire and endurance. She said the earth never forgets kindness, he murmured. You give it respect, it gives it back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but always in time. I listened, his words curling around my heart. Then we'll keep giving, I said, laying my hand over his. We'll outlast this like she did. He turned his hand over, fingers twining with mine. We will, he said simply. And for the first time in weeks, I believed him completely. When the rains finally came, they came all at once. It was early September, the air thick with the scent of dust and lightning. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of thunder rolling across the plains, and when I stepped outside, the sky had opened wide. Ilias was already there, standing in the downpour, his arms lifted as though greeting an old friend. I laughed, and really laughed, and ran to him, the rain cold and sweet against my skin. He caught me by the waist, spinning me once before setting me down. We were both drenched, hair plastered to our faces, but neither of us cared. You see? He shouted above the roar of the storm, his smile brighter than I'd ever seen it. The land remembers. I cupped his face in my hands, water dripping from my fingers. So does my heart, I whispered. He leaned in then, kissing me hard, the rain pouring over us like baptism. It wasn't the hesitant kiss of before, it was full, certain, alive. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against mine, and I felt laughter trembling through him. You're mine now, he said softly, not as a claim, but as a truth that had always been waiting to be spoken. And you, I breathed, have always been mine. After that night, the ranch came back to life. The cattle fattened again, the grass turned green, and the creek sang through its banks with new vigor. We rebuilt the fences, patched the roof, and planted a small garden behind the cabin. Life settled into its rhythm, but it was different now, richer, fuller. Elias taught me how to ride bareback, how to listen to the wind to tell when the weather would turn. I taught him how to make biscuits that didn't burn. Sometimes we'd take the horses out at sunset, the sky painted in strokes of crimson and gold, and he'd lift me down from the saddle, holding me close as the night fell around us. There were no grand declarations, no need for them. Our love spoke through the simple things, the shared chores, the soft glances, the quiet laughter that came easy after long days of work. It was a love built not in haste but in patience, one that felt as steady as the mountains watching over us. Sometimes, when I lay beside him in the quiet hours before dawn, I'd trace the scars along his shoulders, the remnants of a life before me. He'd catch my hand and press a kiss into my palm. Don't look back, he'd murmur. We got enough here to fill a lifetime. And he was right. I'd spent so many years running from the past, but now in his arms I finally understood that peace wasn't found by leaving things behind. It was found by staying, by building something worth keeping. The drought had taught us that love, like the land, needs tending, patience, faith, and the courage to endure. I'd never known anything so strong or so tender. Winter came early that year, soft and white, wrapping the hills and the ranch in a quiet blanket of snow. I had never known winters could be beautiful before Elias. They had always meant loneliness, cold nights, and empty rooms. But here in our cabin, it was different. The fire glowed warm in the hearth, the smell of pine smoke lingering in the air, and outside the world seemed hushed, as if holding its breath for us. I'd sit by the window sometimes, watching Elias chop wood in the yard, his strong figure moving through the flurries. Every swing of his axe, sure and steady. There was something grounding in the rhythm of it, something that spoke to the part of me that had once been afraid to belong. I'd press my hand to the cold glass and whisper softly, "You brought me home." He never heard the words, but somehow I think he always knew. Evenings were my favorite time. We'd eat by lamplight, simple meals of beans and bread, sometimes stew when we had fresh meat, and then he'd pull me close near the fire. His arms around me were my shelter, his heart my home. Sometimes he'd hum old Apache songs, low and deep, the sound vibrating against my back. I never asked for translations, it felt sacred, something older than words. Instead, I'd close my eyes and let the sound of his voice carry me somewhere far and safe. One night, after a long silence, I asked him what his people believed happened after death. He thought for a moment before answering. "We believe the wind carries the spirits to the mountains," he said quietly. "They watch over the living, make sure they don't lose their way." I smiled and turned to face him. "Then promise me," I whispered. If one day I lose my way, you'll call me back with the wind. His eyes softened, that small, crooked smile curving his lips. You'll never lose your way, he said, because I'll never stop calling. Time passed gently, as it does when a heart finally finds its rhythm. Spring returned, bringing color and sound back to the world. The rush of the creek, the call of meadowlarks, the scent of wild sage in bloom. I planted flowers by the porch, bright splashes of yellow and violet that danced in the wind, and Elias carved a small wooden charm, 2 feathers crossed, to hang above the door. For protection, he said simply, tying it there with a leather cord. For our home. There were days when I'd wake early just to watch him sleep, his long hair spilled across the pillow, his hand resting near mine. I'd study the quiet strength in his face, the peace that had once been so hard won, and I'd thank whatever powers existed for giving me this life, this love, this man who had turned my brokenness into something whole. Sometimes when the dawn light touched his skin, he seemed almost made of the land itself. Sun, soil, and wind woven into human form. And I thought this is what love is meant to be. Not a storm, but a sunrise. But the world, no matter how kind, still has its shadows. One morning, a rider came from town with news. A group of settlers had been attacked near the river crossing. The tensions between the settlers and the tribes had flared again, as they always seem to, and fear spread faster than truth. Elias's heritage had always set him apart, though the folks nearby respected him enough not to say it aloud. Still, I could feel their stares when we went to town that week for supplies. The unease, the whispered words that followed us. That night I found him outside, staring at the horizon where the sun had dipped below the hills. They're afraid, he said quietly, of what they don't understand. I went to him, sliding my hand into his. Then we'll show them, I said. We'll live, we'll love, and we'll endure. That's how hearts change. Not by fighting, but by staying. He turned to me then, and I saw a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. You speak like my mother did, he murmured. She believed love was the only war worth winning. I smiled through the sting in my chest. Then let's win it, Elias, every day and every way. The seasons turned again, as they always do. Years passed, quietly but full, each one a new story etched into the land around us. We built more fences, planted more trees, laughed over small triumphs, and comforted each other through small losses. When the storms came, we faced them side by side. When the sun rose, we gave thanks for another day. Our love grew not in grand gestures, but in constancy. The way he always checked the latch on the door before bed. The way I left a lamp burning for him when he rode out late. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch with our hands entwined, saying nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. We'd already said it all in the life we'd built. In every shared sunrise, every quiet meal, every gentle touch that said, I see you. I choose you. Still, now as I write these words, the years have silvered his hair and softened my hands, but his eyes are the same, dark, steady, full of that same quiet strength that first drew me to him. The ranch has grown, new folds in the pasture, new cabins beyond the creek where friends have settled nearby, but our cabin remains the heart of it all. Sometimes on still nights I hear the wind moving through the grass, whispering in the language he once taught me, and I think of that first evening, when I'd been too shy to meet his gaze, when he'd stepped closer and the world had changed. No one has seen my body, I had whispered then, trembling in the half-light. And he, patient, gentle, unyielding in his reverence, and had said, let me be first. I hadn't understood back then what he truly meant. It wasn't about possession or desire, it was a promise. A vow that he would be the first to see me, wholly and without fear, and that he would never look away. He never did. Tonight, as the fire crackles low and the wind hums softly through the pines, he sits beside me, his hand resting over mine. We've seen droughts, storms, and loss, but also the sweet miracle of enduring love. Outside, the moon hangs bright over the valley, silvering the world we built together. He looks at me then, and though words have grown scarce between us, I can still read everything in his eyes. Gratitude, devotion, the peace of a man who has found home. The wind's rising, I whisper. He nods, smiling faintly. It's just the spirits talking, he says. They're saying we did good. I lean against him, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. Then let them sing, I breathe. And they do. A soft, endless lullaby weaving through the night, carrying with it the promise that love, once true, never dies. It only changes shape, from flesh to wind, from heart to forever. And as sleep drifts over me, I know with perfect certainty, I was never lost. The wind called and I found my way home.